and do some voting. And so with that, we're gonna get started with our next panel here. My name is Charles Hernick. Again, I'm with Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum. I'm the director of policy and advocacy, and I realized that the last time I was at the podium, I didn't do too much of an introduction. But prior to joining the organization 5 months ago, I spent over a decade of doing consulting with U.S. Agency for International Development and U.S. Agency, and it opened up my eyes and gave me a lot of experience working on energy projects, not just here in the United States, but abroad as well. And I think that that's one of the themes that you saw in the last panel conversation on innovation, is that global market really does matter, and it certainly does trickle into the conversation that we're about to have. And tariffs, and it's we don't talk about tariffs all that often, but with NAFTA being renegotiated, it's at the top of the American mindset once again. And so in just a second, I'll introduce our distinguished panel here, and thanks to everyone for joining us, and thanks to y'all for. Just a quick reminder, this is being live streamed, and we do hope that folks out there will participate, so feel free to tweet any questions in to NCEW17 on Twitter. For those of you in the room, don't forget your note cards here. You can take those and pass them to some of the folks in the back who will bring those questions right up here so that you all can be participating. We're talking about taxes and trade. So for a little bit of activity, by show of hands, who here about tax reform possibly coming up in the House, in the Senate, and being a priority for the president? Let's do a little show of hands. And this is the point where we realize who's really not paying attention in the room. But if you've been paying attention at all, taxes have been one of those things that politicians return to all the time. We've got to create jobs. We've got to reform taxes. We need a system that is fair for all Americans and for American businesses. And so we're going to dive into that very specifically. What does that mean for the clean energy sector? And expectations will be set or recalibrated tomorrow. Republican leadership is set to announce a new set of their tax reform priorities, so we're looking forward to that. And expectations are high for action. I think that for the first time in many years, there is some confidence that legislation and meaningful reform could move forward. But that raises a lot of questions and some anxiety too, because a lot of folks, including some folks in this room, have worked very hard to set up a system that creates competition and helps some industries get up off the ground. And what we want to talk about is if we should keep it that way. We want to talk about the corporate tax rate and try to identify what is fair for American businesses that want to pay their fair share. But also, what is the corporate tax rate that we need that will make us competitive from an international standpoint? We can dive deep into rules for expensing and what that means, because there are serious implications for how much money is available at the business level for folks to be able to use for future capital investment. And certainly that's something we want to be cognizant of. We want to understand how taxes are earned and how that's treated for taxes that are earned abroad, because increasingly this is a global market, and indeed we heard the story earlier about American firms that are being bought by foreign businesses. What does that mean for America being able to keep its position? So it matters for this industry because, as we've learned, there are a lot of jobs in this space. There are a lot of jobs that have been created recently in this space. One of the statistics that gets to me and speaks a lot to me is this, that solar and wind jobs have grown at a rate of about 20% annually in recent years and are creating jobs at a rate 12 times faster than that of the rest of the U.S. economy. Not 12%, 12 times. And that's a big number. And that's calling out just a small part of what is a bigger clean energy revolution that we've been talking about all day here. And so we want to understand what are the next sectors that we need to be looking at to see that kind of continued economic growth, job opportunity that's important for a new generation of workers that are coming in on the horizon. And then we do want to talk a little bit about NAFTA, trade negotiations, what it means to be internationally competitive in this space. So without me talking too much more, I will introduce our panel here, and I'll start with Carrie. She's the executive director of the Biomass Power Association. Carrie has worked with the association since 2010 and has nearly 15 years of communications and policy experience in D.C. She previously served in the press office of the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you, Charles.
So what I'll do is I'll introduce each of you and then turn it over to each panelist for just a few minutes of remarks so you can introduce your respective organizations. Christopher Mansour is the Vice President of Federal Affairs for the Solar Energy Industries Association. Christopher's sitting right here closest to me. Before joining SEIA, Christopher served in the Obama administration's Department of Interior. He led the legislative agenda. Christopher has also served for 24 years with U.S. Representative Dale Kildee of Michigan as his Chief of Staff and Principal Legislative and Political Advisor. Sitting next to him is Jim Riley, Senior Vice President for Federal and Legislative Affairs at the American Wind Energy Association. Jim leads AWEA's efforts to have the voices of Americans who support wind power heard on Capitol Hill, Previously, he served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Senator Tom Carper of Delaware, working with both parties to craft and drive workable public policies. Before that, he served as Senator Carper's finance director and legislative assistant, and worked for the British Embassy as the senior energy and environment advisor. Last but not least, at the very end, we have Todd Foley, Senior Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs at the American Council on Renewable Energy, also known as ACORE. Todd leads strategic integration of policy development, research, external communications, and interaction with federal and state government and regulatory officials. He has over 25 years of experience in federal and state policy, renewable energy market design, business development, and sales. Prior to joining ACORE, he directed global U.S. policy, communications, and business development, and profile sales for BP Solar. Those are the individuals. We also, as a part of Clean Energy Week, and certainly with this panel, want to give an opportunity for each of our respected panelists to talk a little bit about their organization, so we can increase awareness about what the role of each organization is. Carrie, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. I'm with Biomass Power Association. My members across the country, we got about 40 members across the country representing about 80 biomass power facilities. We purchase fuels from farmers and foresters, so residues, low-value byproducts, and residuals that have no other use, and make power out of them. Typical size of a power plant using biomass is about 20 to 40 megawatts, so we're not talking very big. We're talking about 1% of the total U.S. energy system. So why is biomass important to support? There's two really big reasons. One of them Charles mentioned, which is supporting rural economies. When my members are buying low-value waste materials, they're creating extra revenue streams for farmers and foresters in rural America where jobs are needed. The typical biomass facility accounts for about 4 jobs per megawatt. That's direct and indirect jobs. And then the second reason that it's really important to support biomass is, it might sound counterintuitive, but biomass power is important to forest management and the promotion of healthy forests. We're seeing a lot of forest fires out west, unfortunately, and that can happen because there's a buildup of the low-value materials in the forest that could be used for other uses like biomass. Out east too, you can have the creation, the presence of a wood products market, including biomass, can really help to support and promote forest health, and also can prevent land use changes. So it encourages people that own land to keep forest as forest. And so what does this have to do with the tax code? First of all, it's a parity issue. Our friends at Wind and Solar have grown quite a bit in the last decade or so, and that's partly because the tax code worked very well for them. My other baseload renewable power sources. I know you guys heard from Jeff Leahy at the National Hydropower Association earlier today. So hydropower, biomass, waste to energy, biogas, are sources of energy. Did not get the extension in 2015. We'd like to see that happen in the interest of parity. And also, the tax code can really work for us beyond just putting electrons on the grid. It can promote forest health. By promoting biomass, we can promote jobs in rural areas and healthy forest management.
Thanks, Carrie. Christopher, let's bounce back to this side with you. If you could please introduce SEIA and talk a little bit about how you all have engaged on tax and trade.
Sure. Thanks, Charles. So I'm with the Solar Energy Industries Association. It's a trade association for the solar industry in the United States across the board, from manufacturers to installers, everything from some of the biggest companies you've probably heard of, Solar City, Sunrun, to small companies with a couple of pickup trucks and ladders putting solar on people's rooftops. And as a matter of fact, we have I think I mentioned almost 1,000 members member companies. There's about 9,000 companies in the United States doing solar. 85% of those have less than 20 employees, so it's a lot of small businesses involved across the United States. Obviously, our biggest state is California, given the state policies there, but also just the size of the state and then the good quality of the sunshine. But actually, a few people know that our second biggest state in terms of installed capacity is North Carolina. And this is kind of the story for solar over the last couple of years, is that we are growing into a lot more states like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, up into the Northeast, Massachusetts, New England. These are all big growth states for solar. Right now, we're about 1.5% of generating capacity in the United States comes from solar. Last year was our biggest year. We doubled what we did in 2015. We installed about 15 gigawatts of solar in the United States. We're hoping that that growth is going to continue over the next few years. There's a few items on the horizon. One is the trade issue that Charles alluded to, that we can either talk to about now or as we get into the Q&A, or however you want to do that, Charles. But also the tax issue is very important to the solar industry. The solar industry employs about 260,000 Americans across the United States as of the end of last year. In 2016, 1 out of every 50 new jobs in the entire economy was a solar job. So we're a job growth, a job engine for the American economy as a whole. And those are good jobs, paying jobs. Average median pay is about $25 an hour. So they're good jobs to keep here in the United States. 2 issues. Did you want us to get into issues now, Charles, or how do you want to do that?
What's if you want to mention the trade case, go ahead.
Sure.
But I do want to finish with organization introductions too.
So then, just real quickly on tax. A lot of energy policy is driven by the tax system, our tax code. So the investment tax credit is one is very important to our industry. We were obviously very pleased that it got extended in 2015. We were quite chagrined when the other people did not. It was considered to be a package of all these renewable energies together, and it did not happen the way it should have. So that's very important to our industries to get that kind of surety out to 2021. Mm-hmm. And we can talk more about that later, either in Q&A or afterwards. On trade, we are facing a kind of a very important trade case that is before the U.S. International Trade Commission. 2 foreign-owned companies have petitioned the Commission to raise tariffs on imported solar cells and solar panels. What they proposed would basically double the cost of panels in the United States. We feel we've estimated that would kill about 88,000 jobs in 2018 because what you do is you price these solar facilities out of the market. Our main competition is these guys over here, wind and natural gas. Those are the only 3 new sources of serious electrical generation capacity in the United States: solar, wind, and natural gas. We were the largest last year. I think you guys were the largest in 14. And natural gas has been in there. I think they might have been the largest in 15. So we trade places back and forth. So that's what we're concerned about in the front end here, is this trade case and its potential impact on the ability of our companies to continue to create jobs and grow in the United States. So.
Thanks, Christopher. Busy time in the solar industry right now.
Unfortunately, yes.
Jim, if you could introduce AWEA and,
Sure.
and talk a little bit about your perspective on tax opening remarks.
Well, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm Jim Riley with the American Wind Energy Association, which represents the utility scale wind industry in the United States, not focused on the smaller residential or distributed generation piece. That's one of the differences between our associations. Christopher represents both the rooftop and the utility scale, and AWEA is just the 1,000 or so member companies of the industry, ranging from the large OEMs who are building the turbines and the construction firms that are constructing the towers and preparing the wind farm site, to the developers who put all of that together, the utilities that often buy the electricity, and increasingly the utilities are building their own wind farms, which is an interesting new trend that we're seeing. Also, a number of the customers who are purchasing, so the Googles, the General Motors, who are looking to use wind energy and other renewable energies as part of their electricity mix, are now in our membership. And then a lot of the supply chain companies across the country. Wind employs people in all 50 states, We're over 100,000 employees today and continuing to grow. Our own numbers, you mentioned the 12% combined, and I'll give credit, solar must be better because our numbers are, we are 9% higher than the average. So I think the rest of that comes from the solar folks and other renewables. It's an exciting time in wind. Today we're approximately 6%, gaining on 6% of the U.S. electricity supply, and continuing to build. Unlike California leads in solar, for us, the largest state is Texas, where by a factor of 3, there's more wind farms installed in Texas than any other state. And I know Secretary Perry was here earlier today.
And very proud of that statistic. So.
And he should be. During his time as governor, a lot of that foundational work was put in place. The transmission system, the CREZ line, was instrumental in building that really remarkable success in Texas. Other states, Iowa, and for example, Iowa is over 30% of electricity day on right now. Other states we have 5 states that are above 20% day on, and 14 states across the country are above 10% day on averages from wind energy. So we're becoming a mainstream component of the electricity supply in a lot of the key parts of the country. Going forward, or looking back or going forward, depending on your perspective, in addition to the innovation that has driven these more efficient technologies to capture the wind, the federal policy Christopher mentioned around tax and how tax treatment affects energy policy has been a key part of wind's success. And in 2015, when we saw for us, it was a 5-year extension, and importantly, it is a phase down. It goes down to 0 after 2019. And the wind industry supported that. We would have liked to have seen others extended as well, but we are moving forward assuming, and as we agreed, that we're going to be continuing to bring the prices down of the product. The demand will be there, and we can talk about in the Q&A what we might see coming in tax reform and our priorities, but we view the PTC phase out as a done deal, and we're now delivering on it.
Great. That's very helpful context. Thanks, Jim. Todd, I'll turn it over to you if you wouldn't mind introducing ACORE and talk to me a little bit about your mission and then how you're viewing this tax reform discussion.
Great to be here this afternoon. Impressive agenda, looking at lots of forms of energy. Our mission at ACORE is to accelerate the transition to a renewable energy economy. Our members span the renewable energy technologies and include manufacturers, developers, financiers, utilities, and even users of renewable energy. Many of the corporates Jim was alluding to are also members of ours. And as we say, all the elements, really virtually the entire industry here in the U.S. Around renewables. And I would just note, just to reinforce what's been said a little bit, renewable energy is a very serious player in the U.S. and world power markets. We've seen, as we touched on here already, over the last 5 years or so, the largest new source of power capacity in the United States has come from renewable energy, surpassing all other forms, including natural gas. Last year, it was about 70% of new capacity added came from renewables. About $50 billion a year is invested here in the U.S., and according to BlackRock, a member of ours, renewable energy is the largest source of infrastructure investment in the United States. So that's very significant as well. Oftentimes wind and solar and other renewable energy technologies are the cheapest source of new power in the market. This has been driving immense growth, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Just to touch on the policy front, of course, all forms of energy, in fact, receive some kind of a policy support, and energy markets are fully a function of policy and always have been here in the United States. Thinking of land grants and rights of way for railroads to deliver coal to markets more than 100 years ago, to the use of the tax code to incent all forms of energy today. So there are a couple of key issues we're going to touch on in a bit more depth. The tax is key. It's been a major driver, not just for renewables, but all forms of energy, and lots of other things we consider important in society, including home ownership and so on. And this, of course, the trade issue, especially the Suniva trade case. It's quite potentially a profound impact on the U.S. market for renewables. And so we're, here we are in 2017 with major accomplishments in the sector for growth, for investment, cost competitiveness, and of course, as always, there are some very current and hot political policy issues that are going to be important to determine, the trajectory going forward. Look forward to talking more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Todd, and I think that's important for us, and I hope that, and I'm going to ask you the first question after you take a quick sip there. Tell me a little bit of a story. And so we've heard, and each speaker has talked a little bit about how they view the tax world. Let's talk very specifically about tax breaks, tax incentives. If you could recap for us, we have short memories, and 2015 seems like a long time ago. Tell us a little bit about how the incentives, the tax breaks for solar and wind came about. Carrie, I appreciate good intentions about as much as anybody, but there was a lack of delivery there, and I don't know if that was a clerical error in Congress or in the House or wherever it was. But what I'd like to hear from you, Todd, a little bit about the story, how that reform came about, and then Carrie, if you could talk a little bit about what the But we'll pause for just 1 second
Before we get there.
Before we get there, so we've got cliffhanger questions, but right now I'll take just one moment to reintroduce Dylan Reed from Advanced Energy Economy.
Congressman Ryan Costello, who is from southeastern Pennsylvania, and as I just mentioned, as a Pennsylvania native, I'm very excited to do this, but also believe that Pennsylvania represents really a great example of the energy innovation that's going on today, not only in 2017, but really across decades of what's been going on there. Just from this summer, if you look at the energy mix in Pennsylvania, it's incredibly diverse, pulling 40% from nuclear. I think it's second in the United States in that. 29% from natural gas, which is fueled from the fracking revolution where I came from in the Marcellus Shale region. But that says nothing about the growth that we've seen in solar and wind and energy efficiency jobs, where it's totaling almost 70,000 jobs between over 4,600 solar jobs, almost 2,500 wind jobs, and then over 62,000 in energy efficiency. So you can see how these diverse energy mixes really being supported by strong policies in Pennsylvania, which the congressman worked on when he was a county commissioner. And Adel Bailey has strongly believed since he came to Congress that he represents a leader on advanced energy policy. From our conversations with him and his interaction with businesses in our network, we certainly understand that from his work at the local level as a county commissioner, that he understands the power of energy and what that means for local economies, and that bad policy at the end of the day can be bad for the market, businesses, and consumers. So we certainly know from our conversations that Congressman Costello understands the importance of good policy and for advanced energy, and you can see that here in D.C. As he's a member of Energy and Commerce Committee and has been leading on issues such as the Gibson resolution on greenhouse gas emissions and many other policies. So with that, I would like to introduce Congressman Costello. Thank you.
Nice to be with you all. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you for a couple minutes. I will keep my comments somewhat general in nature and offer them through the perspective of a Republican member of Congress in a district that has always had a particular environmental sensitivity to policymaking, to highlight what the importance of this issue is and why we're focused on it, at least why I'm focused on it, myself and others. And I would just ask at the conclusion of my comments, if you have some thoughts or suggestions on how I can better frame or provide context or describe where we're hopefully headed in the clean energy field, please share that with my office staff. My staff spends a lot of time on this issue. because we think that there's a lot to be said about it from an environmental protection, a public health, and an economic development perspective. I really do think that those issues merge together when you talk about clean energy and reducing carbon emissions and what the long-term policy objective is. It really does touch upon a number of different areas, and I also think that it really hits at the values that a lot of constituents have, but maybe don't fully appreciate relative to how this issue embodies those values. And so as I move into my prepared remarks, I think that generating new American technology, creating more jobs, and growing our economy through providing more affordable energy choices is the economic framework through which we approach the clean energy issue from a policy perspective. Energy independence, obviously, I think is how you would present this vis-a-vis other energy sources that aren't carbon-free from a national security perspective. But from a policy perspective, if we are seeking to innovate first and to provide accessible, available, and affordable clean energy through providing more energy choices, that is a much preferred policy approach than regulating first your particular energy choices. There's a tendency, there are unintended consequences, there are market distortions, and oftentimes the innovation that's out there actually will accelerate beyond what the regulatory framework is in the first instance that might be set up. I can tell you that in southeastern Pennsylvania, the RFS and how that hits southeastern Pennsylvania a little bit differently than other areas leads to market distortions and creates some complications. Whereas if we're just trying to clear the field and allow innovation to lead, I think we're in a much better position moving forward 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now so that we have abundant energy sources, most or all of which are carbon-free or are able to become carbon-free through carbon capture technology. Looking just at regulation as the mechanism through which we get to a clean energy future, I think we're going to find ourselves needing more than that, which is why I focus first on innovation. I also think from an economic development perspective, when you look at where the venture capital dollars go and you look at how much of a competitive advantage we have relative to the rest of the world in the field of innovation, right? This could be medical technology, it could be clean energy technology. The more that we are incentivizing capital in this space, the better off that we will be, and focusing on the technology and the investment in technology and R&D versus making sure we have the right bureaucracy to interpret and enforce a very complicated regulatory framework. I think the former is much preferred to the latter. And as an example, I just read this morning, I think I have it with me, I do. XTO Energy, subsidiary of ExxonMobil, largest natural gas producer in the United States, today announced a set of commitments to reduce methane emissions from its production and midstream operations nationwide. Innovation is already headed in the right direction, I think, and particularly on the issue of methane. It's very thankful that we do have our companies focused on that, because that's been a point of contention, I think, if you look at congressional votes over the past year or two. And the more that we have companies out there in front just doing what needs to be done and not relying on a regulatory compliance that they need to meet, but rather it's the right thing to do, that's really the way I think that we move forward on it. The other thing, if I could step back for a second, because I often get asked, we have the Climate Solutions Caucus, which continues to grow. Carlos Curbelo is a good friend of mine. Ted Deutsch is the Democrat. This bipartisan caucus has grown to, I think, over 50 members at this point. But let's be honest, the question I get asked is, that's great that you have the Gibson resolution, which is, in this iteration of Congress, different member of Congress's name, but the point is you have more Republicans gravitating to the belief that reducing carbon emissions is something that we need to do, and you have more members of Congress realizing that this is an issue that they need to pay attention to. But until you deal in the policy-making space on this, all we're really doing is just talking. And so what do you do from a policy-making perspective? There are some larger, more far-reaching policy objectives as it relates to looking at what the Paris benchmarks were going to be, and if the United States does pull out of that legislatively, what we should be out there advocating for as a replacement. But in the short term, how do you hit singles? And I think the biggest area, if you look at appliance and equipment efficiency standards, much of which has come out in the past several years, there has been some attempt to roll back in that space. This is a situation, we're talking about 60 different categories of appliances and equipment in both the residential and commercial sectors. And these energy efficiency standards, I think, are very important. They're not that costly, and corporate America has already sort of baked that into the cake. And so I think that's an area where we should be playing defense, and we should make sure that we are setting the kind of standards in energy efficiency that are lasting, that are achievable, and that go about accomplishing the objective of requiring less energy to use that equipment. And I think, furthermore, that's an area where we can educate the public as to how just smartly using your goods, your products, goes the way of reducing carbon emissions. Another point related to that, the House passed driverless car technology. The role of sensors and our ability to use them to reduce energy, the battery storage issue and where we're headed from just being able to preserve our energy for longer periods of time. But on the driverless technology and the element of reducing congestion mitigation, it is estimated that by 2040, 33% of all cars will be electronic vehicle driverless technology. It's also estimated that half the cars on the roadway will be so. So there is a tremendous opportunity just through innovation and just through consumer behavior to go about reducing carbon emissions, which I think is exciting. And that's another reason why I don't think the regulate first approach is the right way to do this. I think the innovate first approach and making sure that the regulatory barriers don't prevent innovation is the right approach. And you'll be hearing more about that from myself and other members of Congress in the weeks and months and years to come. And then finally, workforce development issues. You see a tremendous amount of capital investment in wind and solar in the United States of America. And yet, a lot of times when you talk about the jobs that are created, most people don't realize that it's on the installation side, not on the manufacturing side, but on the installation side of a lot of that equipment, which is where a lot of the jobs are in this country, will be in the clean energy sector. And if you look, whether it's advanced manufacturing or in the building trades, we do have a skills gap in this country. And so taking the Perkins Act and some of the other workforce development dollars and making sure that we are educating those even in middle school, creating career awareness, but in high school, so that they have the kind of skills that translate within the clean energy sector for years to come, just to make sure that those jobs stay here. I think the more that the jobs stay here, the more you have an investment by constituents across this country to believe in the importance of clean energy, leaving aside what it does from an environmental perspective, but just from an economic development perspective. Finally, I just want to thank all of you for your advocacy, for your policy proposals, and for making this an issue which is here and now, but which is critically important to the future of our country. I visited Miami last year. They're not debating whether or not the sea level is rising and what caused it, although we know why, the acidification due to carbon. They are preparing their infrastructure to deal with the fact that the sea level is increasing, and they're dealing with the budget constraints of figuring out a way to adapt to that. Which is to say that climate change is not a theoretical issue. All of you know that. But when our municipal governments around this country are having to prepare with the impact, it becomes very important for us to double down on our focus and work on these issues. And we, as members of Congress, rely on those who advocate and who propose policies to educate and inform the public as well as us. There are 1,000,001 things that members of Congress deal with on a daily basis, and just trying to get members to focus on a certain set of issues sometimes can be challenging. I think all of you do an exceptional job at that, and I would just encourage you to continue doing that. One final point. I don't know if anybody saw the Eagles game over the weekend. Did anybody see the Eagles game? 61-yard field goal. Some of you may think that the reason I'm wearing this green tie is because of the Eagles, but it's not. It's the green jobs that we will have in this country for decades to come due to all of your leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Costello. I appreciate you making time in a busy day to come by and talk to us. The only regret that I have is that we didn't have an extra chair on stage, and we could have just grabbed someone who can talk to us a little bit more about tax. So where we left off, we're talking about tax and tariffs, and the question that I had asked you, Todd, and perhaps this is a good way to restart, is to recap and tell us a little bit about the tax incentives, tax breaks that came in 2015, what was on the table, what got left off the table, and how should that conversation from 2 years ago inform what we're about to go through now?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Yeah, I'm just reminded too, with the Congressman's presence here, that the tax policies that we in our sector have benefited from, well before 2015, even dating back to the late 70s. The energy crisis is really which drove a lot of the renewable energy policies. The first efforts at that is the bipartisan support we've had in Congress for the tax incentives. And I think that's been key, and that's been the case through the years. With the support across party lines. When you look back at the recent years on tax policy, what's most notable, aside from bipartisan support, which is critical, is that our incentives require a renewal periodically. The incentives for conventional energy sources are permanent and deep in the code, don't require renewal, so sometimes they're out of sight, out of mind.
Sure.
That said, we in about the 2015 timeframe, I remember it was 2008. Solar was able to get an 8-year extension of the ITC, but because of the scale of wind here in the U.S., the cost to the Treasury, the PTC renewal has really been for a couple of years at a time. So in 2015, it was very important, following some very significant growth in our sector, and with I think the PTC had expired, solar coming up at the end of 2016. We had significant support on a bipartisan basis to address these tax issues. I recall it was in the end of 2014. We were hoping that Congress would extend these incentives. An agreement was close, but didn't quite get there. So we go into 2015, and I remember talking with Senator Hatch, the chairman of the Finance Committee, in June of 2015. This is the first indicator I thought something really interesting could happen that year. Before then, we really were talking about 1-year, 2-year extensions, maybe. But Senator Hatch, at a fundraiser for Senator Grassley, the author of the PTC, noted that he wanted to do a multi-year agreement. He was tired of 1- and 2-year policy extensions. He goes, it's no fun and it's not good policy. Yeah. And he's right on both accounts. And so that was an inkling that we might land something significant. And in the back end of the year, we're able to move a multi-year agreement for wind and solar. Unfortunately, the other renewable energy technologies were left out. Some called that just kind of an inadvertent omission. And so there has been significant bipartisan support to address that since, although it hasn't been done. But the 2015 deal was critically important because certainly for wind, but even for solar, there was a significant amount of market visibility, more market certainty, and we're on that schedule today, and we've seen tremendous growth. Again, we're lacking in the support for the other incentives, and I know all of us are looking for vehicles even now to see what we can do to address the other technologies, biomass, hydro, geothermal, et cetera.
Yeah. Thanks, Todd. That's helpful context, and I think it's particularly important because we want history to repeat itself when it led to a desirable outcome for the businesses in the industry. But we also don't want history to repeat itself when it comes to bad policy that doesn't actually help the industries that we want to see grow, succeed in that space. So Carrie, I do want to ask you, tell me about the biomass industry and how it was affected by not being a part of that last round of tax incentive reform or legislation, I should say. Because I think that at the end of the day, we want mature technologies to be able to compete on a level playing field. I think that that's what we're looking for. But so tell me where biomass is and where you expect to be in the next few years, and if it was a setback at all to not be eligible for those tax credits.
Yeah, so first I think we need to look back at how the Section 45 tax credit has worked. The PTC has worked for biomass. As Todd was mentioning, I think we would agree with Senator Hatch's comments about the 2-year extension not necessarily being a fun thing.
Sure.
And also that's really very important for biomass because it takes a lot more than 2 years to build a biomass facility. So when you have a system where you have to renew it every 2 years, that means that it's basically nearly impossible for my members to actually use that credit. So during the time that we've been technically eligible for a PTC, which is at half the rate of wind, I will add, it's been hard for my members to take advantage. So you see a lot of wind going up, and as a result, a lot of the wind projects are able to offer a lower price to utilities and power purchasers. So that puts my members again at a further disadvantage because they're competing against that lower price and at the same time not
Sure.
able to take advantage.
Okay. So there are a lot of moving parts in the tax conversation, and so let's just talk specifically about the overall corporate tax rate. And so I'm hoping that Jim and Christopher, if you could talk a little bit about when there is this conversation about the overall tax rate, overall corporate tax rate, bringing it down. The president's asking for 15%. Some folks are saying 25%. That's what our European competitors are facing. What does that mean for clean energy, specifically for wind and solar, your industries?
He said your name first, man.
I'm happy to take a first shot. Charles, when I'm in discussions with the wind energy companies over the last 6 months, and they're talking about tax reform, there's 3 general principles that they're focused on, more so than discussing specific corporate rates. And I think the principle of making the tax code more efficient so that the credits and programs that are in place can translate into the most megawatts delivered at the end of the day. I think there's improvements that we would like to see there. And I think the second principle is preserving the investments that are in place today and that are being planned today as a result of the tax code. There is, as mentioned, there's a significant amount of build going on today in wind because of this 5-year tax certainty that gave the companies that, like Bio, need more than 1 or 2 years to plan and site a wind farm. There's now there was a 5-year roadmap there, and so that's what's led to this significant investment. We want to make sure that's protected. And then thirdly, as we look at tax reform, that it's important that any transition from today's tax code to tomorrow's tax code is predictable and provides an opportunity for transition. So I think hearing that from our companies, those 3 pieces probably are more front and center than the debate over just what the corporate rate is.
More important than the exact number
Right. Now,
that they land on.
I know, though, that also matters a lot. And there's different ways that a wind project, you've got your corporate rate and you've got your production tax rate, and those, you need to run those side by side and make
Sure.
a decision. So I think as tax reform comes forward, I would expect our companies, and probably similar with our other boards, will start to think more about what those rates mean for them.
Gotcha. Christopher, do you want to build off that?
Sure. I just say, even stepping back a little bit, I think our companies, I think all the companies represented up here want exactly the same thing as any other companies, any other industry in the United States, which is we need stable federal tax policy, state tax policy as well, but we're talking federal here, and stable policies on the energy side. Our companies just want the government to tell them, here's the rules of the road, here's what the tax code is going to look like for the next 5 years, here's what the energy policy for the next few years is going to look like. And then our companies can work to that. They just need to know what's the path forward. They don't, this idea of up and down like the PTC has experienced over the last few years is absolutely probably the worst way to do tax policy if you're trying to incentivize the creation of new industries. And so the solar industry really has benefited from, as Todd mentioned, we had an 8-year extension that went from 2008 to 2016, and then in 2015, a year ahead of time, got the extension out to 2015 with a ramp down through 2020 and 2021. The investment tax credit steps down from 30% to 26%, then 22%, and then down to 10% at the end of 2022, excuse me. So it just adds certitude. Tell us how we're supposed to function in your economy, and we'll do it. We'll create, we'll create the jobs, we'll invest the money, we'll install the solar. In terms of the overall tax rate on corporations, I mean, our companies, the entire energy part of the economy is so highly competitive in terms of which kind of technology is going to win. Is it going to be wind? Is it going to be solar? Is it going to be natural gas or some other renewables? And so the margins for our companies are so small, so narrow, that to a large extent, they almost don't have, they can't pay taxes because they're not making any profit, almost. I mean, a lot of our companies have talked about us being a profitless prosperity. We've been installing, 2016, we installed 15 gigawatts of solar. You'd think everybody would be walking away with lots of money. But to win those contracts, you have got to squeeze every fraction of a penny out of your proposals that you're putting forward to those utilities who are looking to either buy a solar system facility or buy electricity from a solar facility. And so they're really focused more on the other parts of it, which is the investment tax credit. How can we maintain that for the next 5 years in the current ramp down? And then to make sure that that ITC is usable to the companies in the context of a new tax system that may have different rules on expensing, on depreciation, and some of these other issues, which are too nerdy to get into.
Well, this is a pretty nerdy crowd in some pockets of the conversations I've been having, so I think that we could get into it, but we're actually quite limited on time. And so I do want to touch a little bit on NAFTA because it is a discussion point, and trade is a discussion point. But we'll try to keep this as brief as possible. We have Senator Graham who's on his way here. So we'll just run it from one end to the other, but Todd, we'll start with you. There's the old saying, if it's not broken, don't fix it. When it comes to NAFTA, do you have specific outcomes that you're looking for, or is this, or have you taken a wait and see approach? What's ACOR's thinking?
Well, I think when you look at the trade issues, it also harkens back to what we're kind of suggesting here on the tax side. It's it's stability of policy, stability, business environment, and that's desired by any industry sector. But I think that definitely applies here. On the tax front, the highest priority is, I think, retaining the current tax structure. I just note that in many ways our sector has already been tax reformed, and so we have an important trajectory for the important tax incentives. On the trade issue, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the market right now, and I think it's a bit disconcerting. We now see, especially on the solar side, as a result of the Suniva case, projects being delayed, investment being delayed, people not sure they're going to get modules.
Yeah.
They're not sure what price those are going to be. There is the potential that the ITC goes back retroactively a little bit. So I think that's chilled the market a little bit. And I think as we look at NAFTA and other trade agreements, it's going to be a similar concern. I think at the end of the day, of course, we're all interested in solar and wind being as cost competitive as possible. The industry is doing their part, great ingenuity and reducing the cost of technology and systems and equipment, materials, balance of system. So that continues. It's the market environment, and I think is next. So we're I think really when it comes down to, I think Suniva is the real concern here, especially on the solar front, and the potential at the ITC of looking at steel, because steel is on their agenda as well.
Sure.
And that could potentially affect wind and the other technologies as well. So quick resolution. Hopefully we continue to see an environment where we're seeing what the competition is. While we may on Suniva, the ITC may recommend even tariffs. Solar is competing against wind. It's competing against natural gas. They're very low market prices. It's going to be very difficult. So we're hopeful that as the ITC moves forward, as the process moves forward, that there was injury found, but we're hoping that there would be a non-tariff solution, because it's very important to support domestic manufacturing in the U.S. I think that's been critical. In solar, we're the origin of the technology. In the wind, we see dramatic manufacturing and supply chain development here, along with the other technologies. So to continue market momentum, we need to support domestic manufacturing, but we need to continue to promote the lowest cost technology in the marketplace. And I think, so those are the guiding, I think, principles that we have when we think about NAFTA, think about the Suniva case and potentially other trade issues.
Sure. Todd, thanks for bringing up that need for continuity and stability. I think that's a key thing. And Christopher, I know that you'll have a few words on Suniva, and we'll get to that. But Carrie, talk to me a little bit about trade and how it relates to the biomass industry.
So a few of my members, our association, first of all, represents domestic biomass, so only U.S.-based biomass plants, because the fuel that biomass plants use here in the U.S. is usually within about 50 to 75-mile radius of the facility.
Sure.
That means that most of the fuel is also domestic. There are a few of our members that may occasionally purchase some fuel from Canada, but by and large, we're talking about domestic fuel markets, and so we're less concerned about NAFTA. We're more concerned about creating those domestic wood markets, and particularly for low-grade wood.
Understood. Thanks for, and that's a fine thing too. Is when both supply and demand are domestic, that means a lot of those jobs are domestic and not likely to be outsourced, and not at the whims of trade, of changes in global trade. Jim, how about from a wind standpoint? What are you watching as this negotiation goes on? What are the lessons that you're trying to draw out of these recent conversations?
From the wind perspective, there's not a simple answer because we have such a diversity of companies. You think about a company that's in multiple energy technologies and is selling products around the world, down to a company that's just servicing wind farms in West Texas. And so they approach trade from a different posture. I encourage all of you to come see a wind farm, but one of the things you'll see and take away is these are massive machines that don't move around the country very easily. You tend to build them close to where you're going to put them up, and then once they're there, they're there. So we don't see a lot of cross-border trade on the product. There are some trends down the road. I think you mentioned steel. Steel is a huge component, obviously, of wind towers. And so where that steel is sourced and what its cost will be is something we care about. Raw material that goes into the production of the wind blades can come from anywhere around the world. And so making sure that we're paying attention to cost there. And as wind moves into additional offshore sites in the U.S., probably the early technologies will be not sourced here in the U.S., but the turbines may come from mostly Europe. So I think paying attention there, but less so directly into the NAFTA negotiation.
Gotcha. Thanks, Jim. Christopher, you know the question that's coming to you, and it was asked, and so I'll just read it from this note card because we did, have someone ask the question: how do you anticipate market demand to be affected by a tariff on solar panels to sufficiently support small solar panel manufacturers domestically? And so that's a question stemming directly from the Suniva decision that was made on Friday. If you could speak on that.
Sure. So this is not necessarily our estimate. It was done by IHS and similar one done by Green Tech Media Research, looking at what Suniva, the company who brought the case, in terms of what tariffs they were looking at, 40 cents a watt tariff on imported cells. In their estimation of these two independent research groups, that those higher tariffs would kill about 50%, between 50 and 65% of demand for solar in the United States over the next 5 years.
Wow.
Potentially wiping out what we had already projected at 47 gigawatts of a new growth that should be coming to our country just under, if current law is maintained. Which is, of course, more than what we've already installed up until now, from the beginning of the solar technology all the way up until last year. So that is our concern, is that if these tariffs, if imposed, would kill demand for solar. And it's particularly hard-hitting on the utility scale solar. Because they are, as I mentioned before, these are the companies that are going head-to-head with wind, with natural gas. Utilities have alternatives. They can, if the solar gets too expensive, okay, we'll go with wind. We'll go with a natural gas facility. And so, given the narrow margins on those utility scale projects, they're very susceptible to increases in the costs of some of the inputs. In this case, the most significant one. Even given the fact that, for the most part, I mean, panels are maybe 20-25% of the overall cost of the project. But if you double the cost of those panels, it's not the right kind of trend you want to see. I mean, what has driven our tremendous growth has been that declining cost over time. And as a matter of fact, in 2016, we had, in this utility scale sector, which is about 2/3 of the overall solar industry, 2/3 of that sector were driven not by an RPS in a particular state, but by sheer economics. So these are utilities saying, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to buy a solar facility because it's cheap and it makes sense. If you raise the cost of the panels, you undercut that kind of math and kill demand, and that ends up killing jobs.
Right.
So that's our serious concern with what's been proposed here. On the flip side of that, I think they were also asking, does that help these two companies revive or survive? And to our mind, it doesn't. Because what will happen is that as you kill demand, you also kill the demand for American solar manufacturing in the United States.
Smaller market overall.
And so, I mean, what is really, it's kind of interesting, is we have a graph that shows solar manufacturing writ large going from like 24,000 up to 38,000. At the same time, your prices are coming down like this. Okay, so it doesn't take much to see lower prices, means we can sell more solar, which means more people get employed. And unfortunately, we're hoping that we can present to the Commission and later to the Trump administration some ideas that would potentially help the domestic solar cell manufacturing industry in the United States without imperiling the continued growth of the broader solar industry, which employs somewhere around 260,000 versus somewhere close to less than 1,000 Americans at this time. So.
Understood. And you mentioned the Trump administration. What are the next steps in the decision-making process? How will we know what the outcome is? What's the timeline?
Sure. So right now, the U.S. and we got two ITCs going here: the Investment Tax Credit and the International Trade Commission. So the other ITC
keeps it simple.
That's right. The Trade Commission decided last Friday on the 22nd that yes, these two companies, which basically make up the solar cell manufacturing industry in the United States, that they were injured primarily by increased imports coming in from the outside the United States. There's no allegation of the goods being imported illegally by being subsidized. These are all considered to be fairly traded goods, panels and cells, but there's just too many of them coming into the United States at too cheap a price. The American solar cell manufacturing industry can't keep up. They can't compete. Now the ITC has to take a broader view and say, to come up with recommendations for the president. So having found injury, what would be a remedy that would help the domestic cell manufacturing industry in the United States while not destroying or impeding the continued growth of the rest of the solar industry and indeed the rest of the economy? They then present that their finding and their recommendation to the president mid-November, like November 12th of this year. He then has 2 months through January 13th to decide. Does he accept the recommendation of the ITC? Does he totally reject it and say, I'm not going to do anything? Does he come up with something that's less than what they've proposed or something that's more than what they proposed? So under this section of the law, Section 201 of the Trade Act of '74, the president has very broad and almost unfettered discretionary authority to set those tariff rates or to do nothing at all. So,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Well, I think that what you can tell from the remarks of each of these panels, this is a busy time, and there's certainly a lot at stake in terms of what each industry and what the clean energy industry is going to see overall from a trade standpoint in the next few months, and as these recommendations land on the president's desk. But then also, as here on Capitol Hill, that conversation about taxes goes even further. And I think that one of my key takeaways from this conversation is that and Secretary Perry mentioned this morning in his opening remarks, is that clean energy has really come of age. I didn't hear anyone up here asking for very specific and special handouts. I think that the clean energy industry, very overall and writ large, is just looking for fair treatment, just as any other businesses in the American economy. That old mantra that renewable energy or clean energy is alternative energy isn't the case anymore, and some of the information that Lisa shared with us earlier today is indicative of that. And indeed, this is the kind of industry, clean energy is perhaps the model that we want our elected representatives to be using when we talk about what is responsible tax reform, what does responsible trade look like, to be able to continue the economic growth trajectory, continue the diverse markets that we do have and need to maintain, and continue that job creation that really is important and what we hear about in every election cycle. So my takeaway is that this is a great story to be telling. I appreciate our panelists. Let's give you all a round of applause to thank you for your time and participating.